So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, in this moment, you're aware that you exist. You know what it feels like to be you. There's something it's like to hear these words, to feel the weight of your body against the bed, to notice the texture of the air in the room. And that knowing, that felt sense of being someone experiencing something, that's consciousness. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most confusing things that humans have ever tried to understand. Not confusing in the way that, say, quantum mechanics is confusing, where the math works, but the intuition rebels. Consciousness is confusing in a deeper way, because it's the thing doing the understanding. It's the flashlight trying to shine on itself. And for most of human history, the smartest people who ever lived have wrestled with it, argued about it, written enormous books about it, and we still don't have a consensus answer to the most basic question: what is it? What is this experience of being aware? Where does it come from? Why does it exist at all? But here's the thing, and this is what makes it so fascinating. We've actually made a lot of progress. Not the kind of progress where someone cracks the code and everyone agrees, but the kind where the questions get sharper, the wrong answers get ruled out, and the landscape of possibilities narrows in genuinely interesting ways. And the story of how we got here, from ancient philosophy to modern neuroscience, is one of the great intellectual adventures. So let's walk through it, slowly, piece by piece. No rush. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. You'll catch the thread again. Let's start where most stories about consciousness start, which is ancient Greece. And specifically, let's start with a guy you've probably heard of, Aristotle. Now, Aristotle lived in the 4th century BCE, around 350 BCE or so, and he was interested in basically everything: biology, physics, ethics, politics, logic. But one of the things he thought about very carefully was the soul, which in Greek is psyche. And for Aristotle, the psyche wasn't some ghostly thing floating inside you. It was more like the organizing principle of a living body, the thing that makes a body alive rather than dead. He thought of it as the form of the body, which sounds abstract, but think of it this way. A lump of bronze isn't a statue until it has a particular shape. The shape is what makes it a statue. Similarly, Aristotle thought the soul was what made a body a living body. It was the pattern, the activity, the aliveness itself. And here's what's interesting. Aristotle actually distinguished between different levels of soul. Plants had a nutritive soul, just the capacity to grow and reproduce. Animals had that plus a sensitive soul, the ability to perceive and respond to the world. And humans had all of that plus a rational soul, the capacity for reason and abstract thought. So, in a sense, Aristotle was already doing something that modern consciousness researchers do, which is trying to figure out what's special about human awareness versus animal awareness versus the basic responsiveness of a plant. But Aristotle's teacher Plato had a very different view, and this difference matters because it sets up a tension that runs through the entire history of thinking about consciousness. Plato believed the soul was something separate from the body, really separate. In dialogues like the Phaedo, Plato has Socrates arguing that the soul exists before birth and after death, that it belongs to a higher realm of pure forms and ideas, and that the body is basically a temporary prison for it. The soul is the real you. The body is just the vehicle. Now, you might recognize this basic framework. It's deeply embedded in Western culture, in religious traditions. in the way people casually talk about minds and bodies as if they're two different things. And that split, mind over here, body over there, is going to haunt the study of consciousness for literally thousands of years. We'll come back to it again and again. But let's stay in the ancient world for a moment, because there were other voices too. The atomists, thinkers like Democritus, who lived about a century before Aristotle, had a radically different idea. Democritus believed that everything was made of atoms, tiny indivisible particles moving through empty space. And he meant everything. The soul, consciousness, thought itself, all of it was just atoms in motion. Specifically, he thought soul atoms were very fine, very smooth, very fast-moving, and that they were distributed throughout the body. When you died, the soul atoms dispersed, and that was it. No afterlife, no separate realm, just atoms rearranging. Think about what that means. In the 5th century BCE, someone was already proposing what we'd now call a materialist theory of consciousness. The idea that your inner experience is just physical stuff doing physical things. That's remarkable. And it's essentially the starting assumption of modern neuroscience, that consciousness arises from the activity of neurons, which are physical objects following physical laws. Democritus didn't have the details right, obviously, but the basic intuition? It's the same one that drives research labs today. So already, before the Common Era even begins, you've got the fundamental tension laid out. Is consciousness something separate from the physical world? Something that transcends matter? Or is it a product of matter? Something that emerges from the right arrangement of physical stuff? Plato says one thing. Democritus says another. Aristotle is somewhere in between, trying to find a middle path. And honestly, we're still having this argument. The terms have changed, the evidence has gotten enormously better, but the core disagreement, it's recognizably the same. Now let's jump forward about 2,000 years, because the next really pivotal moment in this story involves a French mathematician sitting alone in a room in the winter of 1619. His name was René Descartes, and what he did next shaped the entire trajectory of Western thinking about consciousness. Descartes was 23 years old, serving as a gentleman volunteer in the army of the Duke of Bavaria. It was November, it was cold, and he was holed up in a heated room, a poêle, the French called it, with nothing much to do. And in that room, over the course of a single day, he had what he later described as a series of visions or dreams that convinced him he'd found a new method for understanding the world. The details of the dreams are strange and symbolic, but the upshot was this. Descartes decided to doubt everything. Every belief, every assumption, every piece of knowledge he thought he had. He wanted to strip everything away until he found something that couldn't be doubted, something absolutely certain, and then build back up from there. And you know what he found. You've heard the phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He could doubt that the physical world existed. He could doubt that his body was real. He could imagine that some evil demon was feeding him false experiences, but the one thing he couldn't doubt was that he was doubting. The very act of thinking proved that there was a thinker. Consciousness itself was the one undeniable fact. Now, here's where it gets really consequential. Descartes took this insight and built an entire philosophy around it, and the result was what we now call Cartesian dualism. The idea that there are two fundamentally different kinds of stuff in the universe. There's res extensa, extended stuff, physical matter, things that take up space. And there's res cogitans, thinking stuff, mind, consciousness, they're completely different substances. The body is a machine, an incredibly complex machine, but a machine nonetheless. The mind is something else entirely. It's non-physical. It doesn't take up space. It doesn't follow the laws of physics. And somehow, and this is the part that Descartes never really solved, somehow these two completely different substances interact. Your non-physical mind decides to raise your arm, and your physical arm goes up. How? Descartes suggested it happened through the pineal gland, a tiny structure deep in the brain that he chose, partly because it was one of the few brain structures that isn't duplicated on both sides. It's a single structure, sitting right in the middle, and Descartes thought that made it a good candidate for the meeting point between mind and body. It's a wild idea when you think about it. This little pine cone-shaped gland, barely bigger than a grain of rice, serving as the gateway between the physical universe and the realm of pure thought. And of course, it doesn't actually work that way. We now know the pineal gland primarily produces melatonin and helps regulate your sleep-wake cycle, which is a nice irony given that you might be falling asleep right now. But Descartes was trying to solve a real problem, a problem he created by splitting mind and body so completely. And that problem, how does the non-physical mind interact with the physical body, became known as the mind-body problem. And it is arguably the central problem in the philosophy of consciousness. It's the question that everything else orbits around. Because if you say consciousness is non-physical, you have to explain how it connects to the physical brain. And if you say consciousness is physical, you have to explain how mere matter, neurons firing, chemicals flowing, gives rise to the felt quality of experience. How does electrochemistry become the redness of red, the taste of coffee, the ache of loneliness? Descartes' contemporaries immediately saw the difficulty. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was one of the sharpest philosophical minds of the 17th century, wrote to Descartes in 1643 and basically said, "Look, I understand your argument, but I don't see how something that has no extension, no physical properties at all, can move something that does. How does a non-physical mind push physical matter around? It's like asking how a ghost can slam a door." And Descartes' replies to her were, honestly, not very satisfying. He acknowledged the difficulty. He tried various angles, but he never really solved it, and neither has anyone else who's taken the dualist position. But here's what's important to understand. Even though Cartesian dualism has fallen out of favor in most scientific circles, its influence is everywhere. When you talk about your mind as if it's separate from your brain, you're being a Cartesian dualist. When you imagine that you could, in principle, upload your consciousness to a computer and leave your body behind, there's a Cartesian assumption lurking in there. When people talk about the brain as hardware and the mind as software, that's a dualist metaphor, even if the people using it would deny being dualists. Descartes' framework is so deeply embedded in Western thinking that we often don't even notice we're using it. And the reactions to Descartes set up the major schools of thought that would develop over the next few centuries. Some thinkers, like Nicolas Malebranche, tried to solve the interaction problem by saying that God intervenes every single time a mental event needs to cause a physical one. Every time you decide to wiggle your finger, God makes it happen. That's called occasionalism, and it's a creative solution, but it raises at least as many problems as it solves. Others, like Baruch Spinoza, took a completely different approach. Spinoza argued that mind and body aren't two different substances at all. They're two aspects of one underlying substance, which he identified with God or nature. So when you have a thought, that's the mental aspect of a process that also has a physical aspect, and they're really the same event viewed from different angles. This is called dual aspect theory, or sometimes neutral monism, and it's actually made a comeback in some modern theories of consciousness. We'll get to those later. And then there was Thomas Hobbes, who was a contemporary of Descartes, and who took the most radical position of all for his time. Hobbes was a thoroughgoing materialist. He argued that everything is matter in motion, including thought, including consciousness. There is no non-physical mind. There is no soul substance. When you think, that's just matter moving in your brain. When you feel something, that's physical processes. Full stop. Hobbes laid this out in his masterwork Leviathan in 1651, and it scandalized a lot of people. It got him accused of atheism, which was a dangerous accusation in 17th century England. But his basic position, that consciousness is a physical phenomenon, is essentially the working assumption of modern neuroscience. So by the mid-1600s, the battle lines are drawn. You've got dualists who say mind and body are fundamentally different. You've got materialists who say everything is physical. You've got people trying to find middle positions. And the question that none of them can fully answer is the same question that had been lurking since Plato and Democritus. What is the relationship between the stuff of the world and the experience of being alive in it? Now, what happens next is fascinating because, for about 200 years, the question of consciousness gets pushed to the side. Not because it's solved, but because something else comes along that's so powerful, so productive, so spectacularly successful at explaining the physical world that it kind of absorbs all the intellectual oxygen in the room, and that something is modern science, specifically the scientific revolution that begins with Galileo and Newton and just keeps accelerating. And the thing about the scientific revolution is that it works precisely by setting consciousness aside. Galileo made a move that was absolutely crucial. He distinguished between primary qualities, things like mass, shape, and motion that can be measured mathematically, and secondary qualities like color, taste, and smell, which he said exist only in the perceiving mind. The redness of a rose isn't out there in the world. Out there are just wavelengths of light. The redness happens in you. And that move, that decision to bracket off subjective experience and focus only on what can be measured, is what made physics possible. It's what made chemistry possible. It's what made engineering possible. Every bridge you've ever driven across, every plane you've ever flown in, every phone in your pocket, all of it rests on this methodological choice to ignore consciousness and focus on the objective, measurable properties of matter. And it worked brilliantly. But it also meant that consciousness itself, the thing that was deliberately excluded from the scientific picture, became harder and harder to bring back in. It became the thing that science doesn't quite know how to talk about. And that's a tension that has been simmering ever since. Because here's the thing. Science didn't just ignore consciousness temporarily, the way you might set aside a puzzle piece that doesn't fit yet and plan to come back to it later. It built an entire framework, an entire worldview, that had no obvious place for consciousness at all. And that framework was so successful, so breathtakingly good at predicting and controlling the physical world, that people started to wonder whether consciousness was even a real thing worth studying, or whether it was just some kind of leftover, some artifact, some trick the brain plays on itself that would eventually dissolve once we understood enough neuroscience. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in the 17th and 18th centuries for a moment. Because even while the scientific revolution was roaring ahead, there were thinkers who refused to let consciousness disappear from the conversation, and the most important of them, the one who really shaped how we think about the mind even today, was an English physician's son named John Locke. Locke was born in 1632, the same year Galileo published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Think about that timing. He grew up in a world that was being remade by the new science, and he wanted to apply the same rigorous, empirical approach to the mind itself. His big book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1689, is one of those works that changes the entire direction of a conversation. And what Locke did was deceptively simple. He asked, "Where do our ideas come from?" And his answer was, experience. All of them. Every single idea in your head, from the concept of redness to the concept of justice, ultimately traces back to experience. He called the mind at birth a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And he meant it. There are no innate ideas, no built-in knowledge. Everything comes in through the senses, and then the mind works on that raw material, combining, comparing, abstracting, building up the complex architecture of thought from simple sensory inputs. Now, that might sound obvious to you. It might sound like common sense. But at the time, it was radical because it directly contradicted the dominant view, which came from Descartes and before him from Plato, that certain ideas, the idea of God, the idea of infinity, basic logical and mathematical truths, are innate, wired into the mind from the start, independent of experience. Locke said no. Even those ideas are built up from experience, step by step. And here's what matters for our story about consciousness. Locke made a distinction that turned out to be incredibly important. He said the mind has two sources of ideas. The first is sensation, the information that comes in through your eyes, ears, skin, tongue, nose. But the second source, and this is the crucial one, is what he called reflection. Reflection is the mind's awareness of its own operations. When you notice that you're thinking, when you catch yourself remembering something, when you feel yourself doubting or believing or wanting, that's reflection. It's the mind turned inward, observing itself. And that's a kind of consciousness, right? It's not just experiencing the world out there. It's experiencing yourself, experiencing. It's that meta-level awareness, that sense of being a subject who is having experiences. And Locke was one of the first people to really zero in on this and say, this is something that needs explaining. This inner awareness, this capacity for reflection, is a fundamental feature of the mind, and we need to understand how it works. He also raised a thought experiment that philosophers are still arguing about today, over 300 years later. He called it the inverted spectrum problem. Imagine, Locke said, that the sensation you get when you look at a marigold is the same sensation I get when I look at a violet, and vice versa. We both call the marigold yellow and the violet purple because we learned those words by pointing at the same flowers. We'd never know the difference. We'd pass every test, agree on every color name, and yet our inner experiences would be completely different. Your yellow would be my purple, and there would be no way, no experiment, no measurement, no conversation that could ever reveal the discrepancy. Think about what that means. It means there could be an entire dimension of reality. The qualitative character of experience, what it's actually like to see yellow, or taste chocolate, or feel the warmth of sunlight, that is completely invisible to objective science. You can measure the wavelength of light. You can trace the neural pathways from the retina to the visual cortex. You can map every synapse and every neurotransmitter. And you still might not know what it feels like to see the color yellow from the inside. That's a profound problem. And Locke saw it right there at the dawn of the modern era. Now, across the English Channel, Locke's ideas sparked a fierce response. The German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the same Leibniz who independently invented calculus around the same time as Newton, which led to one of the most bitter priority disputes in the history of science. Leibniz read Locke's essay and wrote a point-by-point rebuttal called New Essays on Human Understanding. And Leibniz had a very different view of consciousness. He believed in something he called monads, fundamental, indivisible units of reality that are, in a sense, mind-like. Each monad has its own inner life, its own perceptions, its own appetites. The entire universe for Leibniz is made up of these perceiving entities, arranged in a vast hierarchy, from the simplest, dimmest perceptions all the way up to the clear, self-aware consciousness of a human mind. That sounds strange, maybe even a little mystical, but Leibniz was making a serious philosophical point. He argued that you can't get consciousness out of mere matter. You can't build subjective experience from particles bouncing around. And he had a vivid thought experiment to prove it. He said, imagine you could enlarge the brain to the size of a mill, a great factory, so that you could walk inside it and look around. You'd see gears turning, levers moving, parts pushing against other parts. But nowhere, no matter how carefully you looked, would you find a perception. Nowhere would you find the feeling of seeing blue or the taste of coffee. The machinery explains the mechanical operations, but it doesn't explain the experience. Consciousness, Leibniz insisted, must be something over and above the physical mechanism. This is sometimes called Leibniz's mill, and it's remarkable how modern it sounds. It's essentially the same argument that philosopher David Chalmers would make 3 centuries later, when he formulated what he called the hard problem of consciousness. But we'll get to Chalmers. We have some ground to cover first. So you've got Locke on one side, saying everything comes from experience, and you've got Leibniz on the other, saying no, the mind has its own innate structure, its own inner nature, that can't be reduced to passive reception of sensory input. And this debate, empiricism versus rationalism, the blank slate versus innate ideas, it dominates philosophy for the next century. And then along comes someone who tries to resolve the whole thing, and in doing so, he transforms the question of consciousness in a way that's still shaping how we think about it today. His name was Immanuel Kant, and he lived in Königsberg, in what was then Prussia, and he famously almost never left. The story goes that the citizens of Königsberg could set their clocks by his daily walk. He was a creature of routine, a small, frail man who never married, never traveled, and yet produced some of the most revolutionary ideas in the history of human thought. And the key idea, the one that matters for us tonight, came to him in the 1770s, and he published it in 1781 in a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, which is one of those books that's genuinely difficult to read, but absolutely worth understanding, even in rough outline. Here's what Kant realized. Both the empiricists and the rationalists were partly right and partly wrong. Yes, knowledge begins with experience. Locke was right about that. But experience itself isn't raw. It isn't unstructured data just pouring in through the senses. The mind actively shapes experience. It organizes it. It imposes structure on the raw sensory input before you're even aware of it. Things like space and time, cause and effect. These aren't features of the world that you passively discover. They're frameworks that the mind brings to experience. They're the conditions that make experience possible in the first place. So when you look at the world and see objects arranged in space, persisting through time, causing effects on each other, that's not just the world presenting itself to you. That's your mind constructing a coherent experience out of the buzzing chaos of sensory input. You're not a passive receiver. You're an active participant in creating the world as you experience it. And here's why that matters so much for consciousness. Kant drew a sharp line between two things. On one side, there's the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to you, structured by your mind's categories. That's the world of experience, the world you actually live in. On the other side, there's what he called the noumenal world, things as they are in themselves, independent of your perception. And Kant said something that's both humbling and a little unsettling. You can never know the noumenal world directly. You're always trapped behind the lens of your own mind's organizing principles. You can know how things appear to you, but never how they are in themselves. Now, what does that mean for consciousness? Well, it means that consciousness isn't just a mirror reflecting the world. It's more like a projector, actively shaping the image. And it means that the self, your sense of being a unified, continuous I, who is having all these experiences, is itself a construction. Kant called it the transcendental unity of apperception, which is a mouthful, but the idea is beautiful. There has to be some unifying principle, some I think, that accompanies all your experiences and binds them together into a single coherent stream. Without that, you wouldn't have experience at all. You'd have a disconnected jumble of sensations with no one home to experience them. But here's the twist, and this is the part that keeps philosophers up at night. That I, that unifying self, can never fully know itself. You can't turn the projector around and shine it on itself. You can be aware that you're aware, but you can't grasp the ultimate nature of your own consciousness, because every attempt to do so uses the very cognitive machinery you're trying to examine. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. You know they're there, you're using them right now, but you can't look at them directly. Kant didn't solve the problem of consciousness. In some ways, he made it deeper and more puzzling than ever, but he shifted the entire framework. After Kant, you couldn't just ask, "What is consciousness?" as if it were a simple object sitting there waiting to be examined. You had to reckon with the fact that consciousness is the thing doing the examining. It's both the instrument and the subject of inquiry. And that creates a kind of circularity, a strange loop that makes consciousness unlike any other problem in science or philosophy. And while Kant was working all this out in his quiet study in Königsberg, something else was happening in the wider world that would eventually change the consciousness debate completely. Doctors and scientists were starting to poke around inside actual brains. They were beginning to notice that damage to specific parts of the brain produced specific changes in behavior, personality, perception, and, yes, conscious experience. And that empirical turn, that shift from pure philosophy to actual observation of brains and nervous systems, is what would eventually give rise to the science of the mind as we know it. The first person to really push this forward in a dramatic way was a French physician named Paul Broca. And Broca's story is one of those moments in the history of ideas where a single patient, a single observation, cracks open an entirely new way of thinking about the mind. So here's what happened. It's 1861, and Broca is a surgeon at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris. He's a brilliant guy, anatomist, anthropologist, genuinely curious about everything. And he encounters a patient named Louis Victor Laborgne. Now, Laborgne had been at Bicêtre for over 20 years. He'd been admitted originally for epilepsy, but over time, he'd progressively lost the ability to speak. By the time Broca met him, the only syllable Laborgne could produce was tan. That's it, just tan. Over and over. He could vary the intonation. He could say it angrily, questioningly, sadly, but the word was always the same. So everyone at the hospital just called him Tan. That was his nickname. Tan. And here's what's crucial. Laborgne wasn't confused. He wasn't intellectually impaired, at least not in the way you might expect. He could understand what people said to him. He could follow instructions. He could communicate through gestures. His mind was working. His consciousness, in many respects, was intact. He just couldn't get the words out. Something very specific had broken. Laborgne died on April 17, 1861, and Broca performed an autopsy. And when he examined the brain, he found a lesion, an area of damage, in the left frontal lobe, specifically in the posterior part of the third frontal convolution. That's the region we now call Broca's area. And Broca presented this finding to the Anthropological Society of Paris, arguing that this specific region of the brain was responsible for the faculty of articulate speech. Now think about what that means for consciousness. For centuries, the debate had been abstract. Descartes saying the mind is a separate substance. Kant arguing that consciousness structures experience through categories. Beautiful ideas, but untethered from the physical brain. And then here comes Broca saying, look, I can point to a specific lump of tissue, about the size of a walnut, and tell you that when it's damaged, a very specific aspect of your conscious experience, your ability to formulate and express language, disappears. Not all of consciousness. Not your understanding, not your emotions, not your awareness of the world around you. Just this one particular capacity. As if consciousness were modular, as if it had parts. That idea, that the brain is organized into specialized regions, each handling different aspects of mental life, is called localization of function, and it was incredibly controversial. There was a whole earlier tradition associated with a guy named Franz Joseph Gall and his system of phrenology that had tried to map mental faculties onto brain regions. But phrenology had been thoroughly discredited by the mid-19th century because, well, Gall's methods were terrible. He'd feel the bumps on people's skulls and claim he could read their character. It was pseudoscience. So when Broca came along saying something that sounded vaguely similar, this brain region does this thing, a lot of people were skeptical. They didn't want to go back to reading bumps on heads. But Broca had something Gall never had, actual evidence from inside the brain, not skull shapes, lesions, damage, and a clear, repeatable correlation between that damage and a specific deficit in conscious experience. Over the next few years, Broca examined more patients with similar speech problems and found the same pattern: damage to the left frontal lobe. And then, in 1874, a German physician named Karl Wernicke identified a different region, further back in the left hemisphere, near the temporal lobe, where damage caused a different kind of language problem. Wernicke's patients could speak fluently. Their words came out smoothly, in grammatically correct sentences. But what they said made no sense. It was word salad. They'd lost the ability to comprehend language, to connect words with meaning, even though the motor act of speaking was perfectly fine. So now you've got two regions, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, handling two different aspects of the same faculty: language production and language comprehension. And this is where it starts to get really interesting for consciousness, because language isn't just a tool we use. For many thinkers, language is deeply intertwined with conscious thought itself. When you think, you often think in words. Your inner monologue, that voice in your head narrating your experience, that's language. So when you damage the brain's language centers, you're not just affecting someone's ability to chat at a dinner party. You're potentially altering the texture of their inner conscious life. What does it feel like to have thoughts you can't express? What does it feel like to speak fluently but not understand your own words? These are questions about the phenomenology of consciousness, the what it's likeness, and suddenly, they're tied to specific cubic centimeters of brain tissue. And this empirical turn was happening alongside another revolution that would reshape the consciousness debate: Darwin. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, just 2 years before Broca's famous case. And Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection did something profound to the question of consciousness. It placed human beings squarely within the animal kingdom. We weren't special creations with divinely implanted souls. We were primates, clever primates, sure, but primates, who had evolved from earlier forms through the same blind, purposeless process that shaped every other living thing. And that raises an obvious question. If consciousness evolved, then what is it for? What survival advantage does it confer? Why would natural selection produce creatures that don't just respond to stimuli, which a bacterium can do, but that actually experience something while responding? Why does it feel like something to see red, to taste sweetness, to feel afraid? A purely mechanical organism, a kind of biological robot that processes information and produces behavior without any inner experience at all, what philosophers would later call a zombie, would seem to function just as well. So why did evolution bother with consciousness? Darwin himself was cautious about these questions. He wrote about the emotions of animals, about the continuity of mental life across species, but he didn't tackle the hard metaphysical problem head-on. But his framework made it unavoidable. If you accept evolution, you have to ask whether consciousness is adaptive, whether it evolved gradually, whether other animals have it, and if so, how far down the tree of life it extends. Does a dog have conscious experience? Probably, most people would say. A fish? Maybe. An insect? A plant? A bacterium? Where do you draw the line? And what criterion do you use to draw it? This is a question we still don't have a good answer to, by the way. But let's stay in the 19th century for a moment, because something else is happening that matters enormously. In 1879, a German psychologist named Wilhelm Wundt established what's generally considered the first experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig. And Wundt's project was explicitly about consciousness. He wanted to study conscious experience scientifically, using controlled experiments. His method was called introspection. Trained observers would be presented with stimuli, like sounds or colors or weights, and they'd carefully report on their conscious experiences. What did they perceive? How did the experience feel? How long did it take for a sensation to become conscious? Now, introspection as a scientific method has some obvious problems, and we'll get to those. But what Wundt was doing was genuinely revolutionary. He was saying, consciousness isn't just a topic for philosophers sitting in armchairs. It's something we can measure, time, and study in a laboratory. He was trying to build a science of consciousness from the inside out, starting with the first-person experience and working toward understanding its structure. And Wundt had a student, or more accurately, a visitor to his lab, who would take this project in a very different direction. William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher, spent time in Europe, absorbed Wundt's approach, and then went home to Harvard and wrote what many people consider the most important psychology book ever published, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890. It's over 1,400 pages long, and it's magnificent. James was a gorgeous writer, which is unusual for a scientist, and he brought a literary sensibility to the study of consciousness that made his ideas vivid and lasting. James's most famous contribution to the consciousness debate is a metaphor, the stream of consciousness. Before James, most thinkers had treated consciousness as if it were made up of discrete, separable elements, individual sensations, ideas, images, like beads on a string. Wundt's introspective method kind of assumed this, because you'd isolate a stimulus and report on the experience it produced, as if experiences came in neat packages. But James said no, that's not what consciousness is actually like. When you pay attention to your own experience, really pay attention, you don't find a series of separate snapshots. You find a continuous, flowing, ever-changing stream. One thought melts into the next. Feelings shade into perceptions. The boundaries between ideas are fuzzy, not sharp. Consciousness, James argued, is fundamentally a process, not a thing. It flows. And here's what's really clever about this. James noticed that there are parts of the stream that are more vivid and focused. He called these the nucleus of a thought, and parts that are vague, peripheral, barely there. He called those the fringe. Think about what happens when you're trying to remember a word that's on the tip of your tongue. You have a feeling of knowing. You know the word exists. You can almost sense its shape. You might know what letter it starts with. But the word itself isn't in consciousness. That tip of the tongue feeling is pure fringe. It's a conscious experience of something that isn't quite conscious yet. And James argued that these fringe experiences are just as real and important as the vivid, focal ones. They're part of the stream. They give consciousness its texture, its sense of direction, its feeling of going somewhere. James also introduced what he called the specious present, the idea that our experience of now isn't actually an instant. It's a short span of time, maybe a few seconds, during which the immediate past and the anticipated future are held together in a single conscious moment. You're not experiencing this exact millisecond in isolation. You're experiencing a little window of time, a moving bubble that slides along, carrying traces of what just happened and intimations of what's about to come. That's why music works, by the way. If you could only hear one note at a time, with no memory of the previous note and no anticipation of the next one, music would be meaningless. It's the specious present, that extended now, that lets melody exist. But James was also deeply honest about the limits of what he could explain. He wrestled with the relationship between brain and consciousness his entire career, and he never found an answer that fully satisfied him. He acknowledged that every conscious state corresponds to some brain state. He accepted the empirical evidence for that. But he couldn't see how to get from neurons firing to the felt quality of experience. He wrote, in a passage that still resonates today, that the emergence of consciousness from brain activity is as inexplicable as the appearance of a jinn when Aladdin rubs his lamp. It just seems to happen, and we have no idea why. And this is where the story takes a strange turn, because just as James and others were building a science of consciousness, a movement was gathering force that would try to banish consciousness from science altogether. It started in the early 20th century. and it would dominate psychology for decades. The movement was called behaviorism, and its most forceful early advocate was an American psychologist named John B. Watson. Watson looked at the state of psychology in the 1910s. All this introspection, all this talk about consciousness and feelings and inner experience. And he said, essentially, this is not science. You can't observe someone else's consciousness. You can't measure it. You can't verify their reports. The only thing you can actually observe and measure is behavior, what an organism does in response to stimuli. So psychology should study behavior, period. Consciousness, Watson argued, was a concept psychology could and should do without. And Watson wasn't just being provocative for the sake of it, though he was certainly good at that. He had a legitimate methodological point. The introspective method really did have serious problems. Different laboratories, using different trained observers, kept getting different results. Wundt's lab would report one thing about the structure of a particular experience, and Edward Titchener's lab at Cornell would report something completely different. And there was no way to settle the disagreement, because you couldn't check someone's introspective report against anything external. It was, in a sense, unfalsifiable. And science needs falsifiability. So behaviorism swept through American psychology like a wave. B.F. Skinner, who came along a generation after Watson, refined the approach and made it enormously productive. Skinner's work on operant conditioning, how organisms learn through reinforcement and punishment, generated real, replicable, practically useful knowledge. You could train pigeons, predict rat behavior, design educational programs, treat phobias. It worked. And it worked without ever mentioning consciousness. You didn't need to know what a rat was feeling. You just needed to know what it did when you changed the contingencies. For roughly 50 years, from the 1920s through the 1960s, consciousness was essentially a dirty word in mainstream psychology. If you were a serious scientist studying the mind, you studied behavior. You studied stimulus and response. You studied learning curves and reinforcement schedules. Talking about consciousness, about what it feels like to be an organism, was seen as unscientific, almost embarrassing. It was like admitting you still believed in phlogiston. But here's the thing about consciousness. You can ignore it. You can refuse to study it. You can build an entire scientific discipline that pretends it doesn't exist. But it doesn't go away. Every single behaviorist who ever lived knew perfectly well that they had conscious experiences. They saw colors, felt pain, dreamed at night, fell in love. The stream of consciousness that James had described so beautifully kept flowing whether psychologists acknowledged it or not. And eventually, the pressure to deal with it would become impossible to resist. The crack in the behaviorist wall came from an unexpected direction. Not from philosophy, not from introspection, but from machines. Specifically, from the early digital computers that began appearing in the 1940s and 1950s. Because once you had a machine that could process information, that could take inputs and transform them and produce outputs according to internal rules, you had a new metaphor for the mind. And that metaphor would change everything. Because suddenly, you didn't have to choose between the behaviorist's black box and the introspectionist's private theater. You had a third option. You could talk about what was happening inside the organism, internal states, representations, computations, without relying on subjective reports. You could talk about information processing, and that was respectable. That was scientific. That was something you could model. The person who probably did the most to crystallize this shift was a linguist, of all people, Noam Chomsky. In 1959, Chomsky published a review of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, and it was devastating, not just critical, devastating in the way that makes you realize the entire framework you've been working in might be fundamentally inadequate. Skinner had tried to explain language learning the same way he explained everything else, through reinforcement, through stimulus and response, through shaping. A child says something that approximates a word. The parent reinforces it. The child gradually learns to speak. Sounds reasonable, right? But Chomsky pointed out something that should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't. Children don't just repeat sentences they've heard. They generate entirely new sentences they've never encountered before. A 3-year-old will say something like, "I goed to the store," applying a grammatical rule, the past tense rule, to an irregular verb. Nobody taught them that rule explicitly. Nobody reinforced that specific sentence. The child extracted an abstract pattern from the language they heard and applied it productively. That's not stimulus and response. That's an internal representation. That's a rule operating inside the mind. And if you need internal representations to explain something as basic as how a toddler talks, then the behaviorist program of ignoring what's inside the head is doomed. Chomsky's review landed like a bomb, but the ground had already been shifting. In 1956, there was a symposium at MIT that historians sometimes call the birthday of cognitive science. George Miller presented his famous paper on the magical number 7, the idea that short-term memory can hold roughly 7 items, plus or minus 2. Herbert Simon and Alan Newell demonstrated a computer program called the Logic Theorist that could prove mathematical theorems. Chomsky presented early versions of his generative grammar. All of these contributions shared something crucial. They treated the mind as an information processing system, not a black box, not a soul, an information processor, like a computer, with inputs, outputs, and, here's the key part, internal states that do real computational work. This was the cognitive revolution, and it swept through psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, and philosophy over the course of the 1960s and 1970s. And it was genuinely exciting. Suddenly you could study memory, attention, perception, language, problem-solving, decision-making, all these rich mental phenomena using rigorous experimental methods. You could build computational models. You could make precise, testable predictions about reaction times and error rates. Cognitive psychology was enormously productive, and it still is. But here's what's fascinating and a little bit ironic. The cognitive revolution brought the mind back into science. It brought internal representations back. It brought mental states back. But it didn't really bring consciousness back. Not directly. Because the computational metaphor, for all its power, has a peculiar blind spot. Think about it this way. When cognitive scientists talk about information processing, they're talking about the functional organization of the system. They're talking about how information flows, how it gets transformed, how representations are stored and retrieved. And all of that can be described without ever mentioning what any of it feels like. You can describe every detail of how the visual system processes color information, the wavelengths hitting the retina, the opponent channels, the cortical processing, and you've explained something genuinely important. But you haven't explained why red looks like that, why it has that particular warm, vivid, unmistakable quality. You haven't touched the experience. This is the point where a philosopher named David Chalmers would later drive a wedge that split the entire field. But we'll get to Chalmers. First, let's stay with the computational era for a moment, because something really interesting was happening in the philosophy of mind, during the 1960s and 1970s that would set the stage for everything that followed. The dominant philosophical position that emerged alongside cognitive science was called functionalism. And it's one of those ideas that seems so natural, so obvious, once you hear it, that you wonder why anyone ever thought differently. The basic idea is this: mental states are defined not by what they're made of, but by what they do, by their functional role. Pain, for instance, isn't defined by being a particular pattern of neurons firing. It's defined by its causal role in the system. It's the state that's typically caused by tissue damage, that typically causes withdrawal behavior and distress, that typically makes you want it to stop. If some alien creature made of silicon had an internal state that played exactly the same functional role, caused by damage, leading to avoidance, motivating escape, then that state would be pain, even though it's not made of neurons. This was incredibly appealing. It meant that consciousness wasn't tied to any particular physical substrate. It could be realized in neurons, in silicon chips, in anything, as long as the right functional organization was in place. It fit perfectly with the computer metaphor. Just as the same software can run on different hardware, the same mental states could be realized in different physical systems. The philosopher Hilary Putnam was one of the key architects of this view, and it became the default position in philosophy of mind for years. But there was a problem, and the problem was one that kept surfacing no matter how cleverly people tried to avoid it. You can describe the functional role of pain perfectly: what causes it, what it causes, how it relates to other mental states, and you still haven't captured the thing that matters most about pain: the fact that it hurts, the felt quality, the experience. Functionalism could tell you everything about the job that pain does in the system, but it seemed to leave out the one thing that makes pain, well, painful. This worry had been lurking since the very beginning of the cognitive revolution, but it was a philosopher named Thomas Nagel who gave it its most memorable expression. In 1974, Nagel published a short paper called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And the title, basically, is the argument. Nagel pointed out that a bat perceives the world through echolocation. It sends out ultrasonic pulses and builds a picture of its environment from the returning echoes. We can study bat neuroscience in exquisite detail. We can map every neural pathway. We can build computational models of echolocation. But none of that tells us what it's like to be a bat. What the subjective experience of echolocation feels like from the inside. There is something it is like to be a bat. The bat has a point of view, a perspective, a way the world appears to it. And that something is precisely what our objective scientific descriptions leave out. Now, you might think, well, of course we can't know what it's like to be a bat. We're not bats. But Nagel's point was deeper than that. It wasn't just about the practical difficulty of getting inside a bat's head. It was about a fundamental gap between objective description and subjective experience. No matter how complete your third-person scientific account of a conscious system is, it seems to leave out the first-person reality of what it's like to be that system. And that gap doesn't close just because you add more detail. You could know every single fact about bat neuroscience and still not know what echolocation feels like. This is where things get genuinely philosophically vertiginous, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment. Because Nagel wasn't saying science is bad, or that consciousness is supernatural, or that we should give up. He was saying something more subtle and more unsettling. He was saying that our current conception of objectivity, The very framework that makes science so powerful might be structurally incapable of capturing consciousness. Because objectivity means describing things from no particular point of view, and consciousness is precisely the existence of a particular point of view. Think about what that means. Science works by abstracting away from individual perspectives to find what's universally true. That's its genius. The laws of physics don't depend on who's observing them. The chemical composition of water doesn't change based on your mood, but consciousness is inherently perspectival. It's what the world looks like from here, from this vantage point, through these eyes, with this history. And when you abstract away from that perspective to get an objective description, you've abstracted away the very thing you were trying to explain. Nagel's paper was a quiet earthquake. It didn't propose a solution. It just laid out the problem with devastating clarity. And it set the stage for what would become, in the 1990s, one of the most intense and productive debates in the history of philosophy. But before we get there, something else was happening in the 1970s and 1980s that would prove just as important. A revolution in neuroscience that would give us, for the first time, the ability to actually watch the brain in action. Because up until this point, most of what we knew about the brain and consciousness came from damage, from strokes, from injuries, from cases like Broca's patient Leborgne, where you could correlate a specific deficit with a specific lesion found after death. You learned about the brain the way you might learn about a clock by smashing it with a hammer and seeing which functions stopped. Informative, sure, but crude. What you really wanted was to look inside the working brain, the intact brain, the brain in the act of being conscious. And starting in the 1970s, new technologies began making that possible. The first major breakthrough was the CT scan, computerized tomography, which used X-rays taken from multiple angles to construct cross-sectional images of the brain. Then came PET scanning, positron emission tomography, which could actually track metabolic activity. You could inject a radioactive tracer, have a person perform a mental task, and see which brain regions lit up with increased blood flow. For the first time, you could watch the brain think, or at least, you could watch the brain's plumbing change while thinking was presumably happening. And that distinction between the metabolic signature and the experience itself would turn out to matter enormously. Then, in the early 1990s, came functional MRI, fMRI, which could track blood oxygenation changes with much better spatial resolution and without radiation. Suddenly, consciousness research had a tool. You could put someone in a scanner, show them a face or play them a sound, or ask them to imagine walking through their house, and you could see which brain regions responded. You could compare the brain activity of someone who was conscious versus someone under anesthesia. You could study patients in vegetative states and ask whether there was still someone home. And this is where the science of consciousness really began to crystallize as a field, because now you had the philosophical questions that Nagel and others had sharpened. You had the computational framework from cognitive science, and you had the neuroimaging tools to actually look at what the brain was doing. All the pieces were on the table. What was needed was someone to frame the question in a way that was precise enough to guide research, but honest enough to acknowledge what we didn't know. And in 1995, a young Australian philosopher named David Chalmers did exactly that, in a way that would define the field for the next 3 decades, when he stood up at a conference in Tucson, Arizona, and drew a line that nobody had drawn quite so cleanly before. He called it the distinction between the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. And the word easy here, you should know, was deliberately provocative. Chalmers wasn't saying these problems were simple. He was saying they were the kind of problems that science, in principle, knows how to attack. Things like explaining how the brain integrates information from different senses, how we can discriminate between stimuli, categorize them, react to them, how the brain controls behavior, how attention works, how we can report on our internal states. These are staggeringly complex problems. Any one of them could occupy a career. But they're all problems of mechanism. You're looking for a function. You're looking for the neural circuit or computational process that performs that function. And eventually, with enough clever experiments and enough time, you'll find it. That's how science works. You identify the mechanism and you explain the behavior. But then there's the other thing. The thing that remains even after you've explained every mechanism. And that's the fact that all of this processing is accompanied by experience. There's something it's like to see red. There's something it's like to feel pain, to taste coffee, to hear a minor chord resolve. And this felt quality, this inner movie, this luminous fact that experience exists at all, Chalmers called the hard problem. Not hard as in difficult, though it is that too. Hard as in a fundamentally different kind of problem. Because even if you mapped every neuron, traced every connection, simulated the entire brain in a computer, you'd still face the question, why does all that processing feel like anything? Why isn't it just information flowing in the dark? Now think about what that question is really asking. It's not asking for more data. It's not asking for a better brain scan. It's asking why there's a light on inside. Why physical processes, which, as far as physics tells us, are just particles and forces following mathematical laws, give rise to the sheer fact of subjective experience. And Chalmers's genius, really, was in making this distinction so crisp that you couldn't just wave it away. Before Tucson, a lot of researchers had a kind of implicit assumption that once you explained enough of the mechanisms, consciousness would just sort of fall out of the explanation naturally. Chalmers was saying, no, actually, it won't. You could explain every easy problem perfectly and still not have touched the hard one. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some people in that audience felt like Chalmers had articulated something they'd been struggling to say for years. Others thought he was making a philosophical mistake, drawing a line where no line existed, creating a mystery out of a confusion. Daniel Dennett, who was already one of the most prominent philosophers of mind in the world, essentially argued that the hard problem was an illusion, that once you really truly explained all the easy problems, there'd be nothing left over to explain. Consciousness, for Dennett, was what all those mechanisms do. There's no extra ingredient, no residual mystery. He compared the hard problem to vitalism. Remember how people used to think there was some special life force, some elan vital, that made living things alive? And then biology explained metabolism and reproduction and evolution, and the life force just evaporated. Dennett thought consciousness was like that. Explain the functions, and the mystery dissolves. And here's the thing. This isn't a debate that's been resolved. It's the debate. It's the fault line that runs through the entire field of consciousness studies to this day. On one side, you have people who think the hard problem is real, that subjective experience is something over and above the physical mechanisms, something that requires a new kind of explanation. On the other side, you have people who think the hard problem is a seductive confusion, that it feels deep, but is actually the product of our cognitive limitations or our philosophical habits, and both sides have brilliant, serious people on them. But let's stay with Chalmers for a moment, because his thinking didn't stop at identifying the problem. He also proposed something about what a solution might look like, and it was genuinely radical. He suggested that maybe consciousness couldn't be explained in terms of anything more basic, that maybe experience was fundamental, like mass or charge or space-time. Not something that emerges from simpler physical processes, but something that's been there all along, woven into the fabric of reality at the most basic level. This view has a name. It's called panpsychism, and it has a long philosophical history going all the way back to some of the pre-Socratics we talked about at the very beginning, Thales, who thought all things had souls. But Chalmers gave it a modern, rigorous formulation. He wasn't saying that rocks are conscious the way you and I are conscious. He was suggesting that perhaps every physical system has some associated experiential property, however faint, however simple, and that complex consciousness like ours is what you get when you organize those basic experiential properties in the right way. Now, if that sounds strange, it is. But here's why Chalmers and others take it seriously. If consciousness can't be explained by physical mechanisms alone, if there's an explanatory gap between objective description and subjective experience, which is exactly what Nagel was pointing at 20 years earlier, then you really only have a few options. You can deny that consciousness exists, which is hard to do with a straight face, because it's the one thing you're most certain of. You can say it exists, but is somehow identical to physical processes in a way we don't yet understand. Or you can say that consciousness is something fundamental that needs to be added to our picture of the world. Panpsychism is that third option, and while most scientists initially dismissed it, it's had a remarkable resurgence in the last decade or so. Serious philosophers and even some neuroscientists have started exploring it, not because they think it's obviously true, but because the alternatives all have their own deep problems. But anyway, the point is that Chalmers's Tucson presentation in 1995 was a watershed moment. It gave the field a shared vocabulary. After Tucson, you couldn't do consciousness research without positioning yourself relative to the hard problem. Are you trying to solve it, dissolve it, sidestep it? Every major theory of consciousness that's been developed since then can be understood, at least in part, as a response to Chalmers's challenge. And there were several major theories that emerged in this period, each one taking a different approach. Let's talk about the ones that really shaped the field, because they're all fascinating in different ways, and they all reveal something about how hard this problem actually is. One of the first and most influential was Bernard Bars's global workspace theory, which actually predates Chalmers's formulation. Bars published his key book in 1988, but it gained enormous traction in the 1990s and 2000s as neuroimaging data started to support it. The basic idea is beautiful in its simplicity. Imagine your brain as a theater. There's a vast audience sitting in the dark. These are all the unconscious processors, the specialized modules that handle vision, language, motor control, memory, all working away in parallel without you being aware of most of it. And then there's a stage, brightly lit, with a spotlight. Whatever is in that spotlight, that's what you're conscious of. Consciousness, in this model, is what happens when information gets broadcast widely across the brain, made available to many different processing systems simultaneously. Most of what your brain does stays local, stays in the dark. But when something becomes important enough, a sudden noise, a surprising thought, the face of someone you love, it gets pulled onto the stage and broadcast globally. And that global broadcast is consciousness. What's elegant about this is that it explains a lot of the features of consciousness that we actually observe. Consciousness has limited capacity. You can only be aware of a few things at once, just like a spotlight can only illuminate a small part of the stage. Consciousness integrates information. When you consciously perceive something, it's available to your memory systems, your language systems, your decision-making systems, all at once. And consciousness seems to be associated with widespread brain activity, which is exactly what neuroimaging shows. When you're conscious of a stimulus, you see activation spreading across many brain regions. When the same stimulus is processed unconsciously, the activation stays local. Stanislas Dehaene, a French neuroscientist, took Bars's framework and gave it a detailed neural architecture. He called his version Global Neuronal Workspace Theory, and he backed it up with some really clever experiments. One of the most striking involved what's called masking. You flash a word on a screen very briefly, say for about 50 milliseconds, and then immediately follow it with a pattern that obscures it. If the word is flashed quickly enough and masked tightly enough, people genuinely don't see it. They'll tell you the screen was blank, but their brains still process the word. You can measure unconscious priming effects where the masked word influences their response to a subsequent word. Now here's what Dehaene found. When the word is presented just a little longer, or the mask is delayed just slightly, there's a sudden transition. The person goes from not seeing the word at all to seeing it clearly. And in the brain, what you see is this dramatic ignition. Activity suddenly spreads from local sensory areas to a widespread network involving prefrontal and parietal cortex. It's almost like a phase transition, like water suddenly turning to ice. Below the threshold, local processing. Above it, global broadcast. And that broadcast correlates with conscious awareness. This was powerful evidence. But notice something. Global workspace theory tells you what consciousness does. It broadcasts information. It tells you what neural events correlate with consciousness, widespread cortical ignition. But does it tell you why that broadcast feels like anything? Does it explain the redness of red or the painfulness of pain? Chalmers would say no. It solves an easy problem beautifully. The problem of how the brain selects and integrates information for flexible, reportable processing. But it doesn't touch the hard problem. Dehaene himself has been somewhat ambivalent about this. At times, he suggested that the hard problem might dissolve once we understand the mechanisms well enough. At other times, he's acknowledged that something might be left over. And this is the pattern you see with almost every major theory. Each one illuminates something real and important about consciousness. Each one captures some aspect of what's going on. And each one leaves the deepest question: why experience exists at all? Sitting there, patient and unanswered, like a stone at the bottom of a well. Which brings us to another theory that took a very different approach, one that started not with cognitive architecture, but with information itself. In the early 2000s, a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi, working at the University of Wisconsin, proposed something called Integrated Information Theory, IIT for short. And where global workspace theory starts with the theater metaphor and asks what consciousness does, Tononi started from the opposite direction. He started with the experience itself and asked what properties a system must have in order to generate it. Think about how different that starting point is. Most theories begin with the brain, with neurons, with information processing, and then try to work their way toward experience. Tononi flipped it. He said, "Let's begin with what we know most intimately, the the fact that experience exists, that it has certain characteristics. And let's see what kind of physical system could possibly produce something with those characteristics. It's almost like reverse engineering consciousness from the inside out. And the way he did this was by identifying what he called the axioms of consciousness. Not axioms in the mathematical sense exactly, but starting observations so basic, so self-evident, that you can't really deny them without contradicting your own experience. Here's the first one. Consciousness exists. That's it. That's the most fundamental starting point. You are having an experience right now. Even Descartes would nod along. This is the one thing you cannot doubt. The second axiom is that consciousness is structured. Your experience right now isn't just a blob of undifferentiated feeling. It has parts. It has relationships. You might be hearing these words, feeling the weight of a blanket, sensing the darkness behind your eyelids, all at once, all organized in a particular way. The third axiom is that consciousness is informative. Every conscious experience is specific. It's this experience, and not any of the billions of other experiences you could be having. When you see blue, that experience is what it is precisely because it's different from seeing red, or hearing a trumpet, or tasting salt. The fourth is that consciousness is integrated. You can't split your experience in half. You don't have one consciousness watching the left side of the room and another watching the right. It all comes together as one unified field. And the fifth axiom is that consciousness is exclusive. At any given moment, you're having this experience, this particular one, and not some other. Now, here's where Tononi did something genuinely ambitious. He took those axioms, those observations about what experience is like from the inside, and he translated each one into a corresponding requirement about the physical system generating that experience. He called these the postulates of I-IT, and the central postulate, the one that gives the theory its name, is about integration. If consciousness is unified, if it can't be split apart, then the physical system generating it must also be unified in a specific way. The information it generates must be integrated, meaning the system as a whole must generate more information than the sum of its parts. And to measure this, Tononi introduced a quantity he called phi. Phi, written with the Greek letter, represents the amount of integrated information a system generates. The idea is that the higher a system's phi, the more conscious it is. A system with 0 phi, where you could divide it into independent parts without losing anything, would have no consciousness at all. A system with very high phi, where everything is deeply interconnected and the whole is genuinely more than the sum of its parts, would have rich, vivid experience. Let me give you an analogy that might help this land. Think about a digital camera sensor. It has millions of photodiodes, each one independently detecting light. Each pixel does its own thing. You could cut the sensor in half, and each half would work just fine on its own. You'd lose half the image, but each remaining pixel would still function. The information isn't integrated. Now think about your visual cortex. The neurons there are massively interconnected. They influence each other. The activity of the whole network creates something that couldn't exist if you just added up what each neuron was doing independently. You can't split it cleanly. The whole is doing something the parts alone could never do. That, in Tononi's framework, is integrated information. That's phi. And here's what's really interesting about this. I-IT doesn't just say brains are conscious and cameras aren't. It says consciousness is a matter of degree, and it's determined by the intrinsic causal structure of a system, which means, at least in principle, you could calculate the phi of any system. A brain, a computer, a thermostat, a network of neurons, even a simple logic gate. And whatever has phi has some degree of experience. Now you might be hearing echoes of something from earlier. Remember Chalmers floating the idea of panpsychism? The notion that consciousness might be fundamental, that even simple systems might have some flicker of experience. IIT actually gives that intuition a formal backbone. Under IIT, a simple system like a photodiode might have a tiny, almost negligible amount of phi, and therefore a correspondingly tiny, almost negligible amount of experience. Not human experience, not anything like thought or emotion, just something. Some faint, minimal what-it-is-likeness. Tononi himself has embraced this implication. He's argued that IIT is a form of panpsychism, though a very precise and constrained one. Not everything is conscious in any meaningful sense, but any system with integrated information has some non-zero degree of experience. This is wild to think about, right? Especially lying here in the dark. The idea that consciousness isn't some magical spark that appears only in human brains or only in mammalian brains, but that it's woven into the fabric of physical systems wherever information is integrated in the right way. It's a beautiful idea. It's also deeply controversial. Let's talk about why. The first objection is practical. Calculating phi for any real system is computationally nightmarish. For even a modestly sized network, say a few hundred neurons, computing phi requires you to evaluate every possible way of partitioning the system, find the partition that makes the least difference, and measure the information lost across that partition. The number of possible partitions grows exponentially. For the human brain, with its 86 billion neurons and trillions of connections, calculating phi is not just hard. It's effectively impossible with any computer we can imagine. So IT makes a bold claim about what consciousness is, but it can't actually verify that claim for the systems we care most about. The second objection is more philosophical, and it cuts deep. Scott Aaronson, the computer scientist, pointed out in 2014 that certain simple systems, like a large grid of logic gates arranged in a specific way, could in principle have enormous phi without doing anything that looks remotely intelligent or aware. You could construct a system that, by IIT's own math, should be blazingly conscious, but that doesn't process information in any meaningful sense. It's just a structure that happens to be highly integrated. Tononi responded to this, and the debate got technical, but the core worry lingered. Is phi really measuring consciousness, or is it measuring something else, some mathematical property that happens to correlate with consciousness in brains, but could come apart from it in other systems? And then there's the question of testability. A good scientific theory needs to make predictions you can check. IIT does make some predictions. For instance, it predicts that consciousness should be associated with the back of the cortex, the posterior hot zone, rather than the prefrontal cortex, because the posterior cortex has a more grid-like, highly integrated architecture. This actually lines up with some recent neuroscience, which is intriguing. There was a large adversarial collaboration, a project where proponents of IIT and proponents of global workspace theory agreed in advance on experiments that would test predictions unique to each theory. The results, published around 2023, were mixed. Some findings favored IIT's predictions about the posterior cortex, while others were more ambiguous. Neither theory scored a clean knockout. But here's what I find genuinely fascinating about IIT, regardless of whether it turns out to be correct in all its details. It changed the conversation. Before Tononi, most theories of consciousness were what you might call functionalist. They defined consciousness by what it does, by its role in processing information, by its function in the cognitive system. IIT said no, consciousness is about what a system is Intrinsically, it's about the system's internal causal structure, not about its inputs and outputs. That's a fundamentally different claim, and it forced everyone else to sharpen their thinking, which brings up another theory that emerged around the same time, one that tried to thread the needle between the mechanistic approach and the experiential approach. This is the work of Carl Friston, a neuroscientist at University College London, and his free energy principle. Now, Friston is one of those figures in science who is either a towering genius or maddeningly obscure, depending on who you ask. His papers are legendarily difficult to read. There's a running joke in neuroscience that no one fully understands Friston except Friston himself, and even he might have doubts on Tuesdays. But the core idea, when you strip away the formalism, is surprisingly intuitive. Friston's free energy principle says that any self-organizing system, anything that maintains its own boundaries, that persists over time rather than dissolving into its environment, must minimize something called free energy. Free energy in this context isn't the thermodynamic kind. It's an information-theoretic quantity. Think of it roughly as surprise. A living organism, a brain, even a single cell, maintains itself by constantly predicting what's going to happen next and then updating those predictions when they're wrong. The system builds a model of its world and tries to minimize the difference between what it expects and what it actually encounters. When there's a mismatch, when something surprising happens, the system can either update its model or act on the world to make the surprise go away. Close the window because it's cold. Pull your hand back from the flame. Shift your attention to the unexpected sound. Now, Friston himself has been careful about how far he pushes this toward consciousness specifically. The free energy principle is really a theory about how biological systems maintain themselves, how brains do inference, how perception and action are two sides of the same coin. But other researchers have taken it further, arguing that the kind of self-modeling that the free energy principle describes, a system that has a model of itself, that predicts its own states, that is in some sense aware of its own boundaries, might be the seed of subjective experience. If you're a system that models the world and models yourself modeling the world, maybe that recursive self-modeling is what it feels like to be conscious. This connects to something called higher-order theories of consciousness, which have their own long history. The basic idea is that a mental state becomes conscious when there's another mental state that represents it, when you're not just seeing red, but are in some sense aware that you're seeing red. Philosophers like David Rosenthal have developed this line of thinking in detail, and neuroscientists like Hak-Wan Lau have looked for the neural signatures of these higher-order representations. The appeal is obvious. It explains why we can have unconscious perceptions, unconscious emotions, unconscious processing. Those are first-order states that lack the higher-order representation that would make them conscious. But here's the thing about higher-order theories. They run into a version of the same wall. You can explain the mechanism. This neural circuit represents that neural circuit's activity. But you still haven't explained why that representation feels like anything. Why doesn't the whole system just run in the dark, processing representations of representations without any inner light turning on? It's the hard problem again, showing up at the door like an uninvited guest who simply will not leave. And this is where the story of consciousness science stands today, in a way that's both humbling and exciting. We have multiple sophisticated theories: global workspace, IIT, predictive processing, higher order theories, each capturing something real, each supported by some evidence, each leaving something unexplained. They're not all compatible with each other. They make different predictions. They disagree about where in the brain consciousness lives, about what kinds of systems can be conscious, about whether the hard problem is a real problem or a confusion that will dissolve. And yet, for the first time in human history, these are empirical questions, not just philosophical ones. We have tools, brain imaging, optogenetics, computational modeling, adversarial collaborations, that can actually test at least some of these claims. The field is messy and contentious and full of disagreements, but it's alive in a way it wasn't even 30 years ago. When Francis Crick and Christoph Koch wrote their famous paper in 1990 calling for a scientific attack on consciousness, a lot of serious scientists thought they were wasting their time. Now there are journals, conferences, major grants, entire research programs dedicated to exactly this question. And there's one more dimension of this whole story that we haven't really explored yet, one that's become increasingly urgent in just the last few years, one that takes everything we've been talking about, the hard problem, integrated information, global workspace, predictive models, and forces us to ask these questions, not just about biological brains, but about something else entirely. Because as artificial intelligence systems have grown more sophisticated, more fluent, more eerily capable of producing language that sounds like it comes from a thinking, feeling mind, a question that used to be purely hypothetical has started to feel very real. Can a machine be conscious? Not just smart, not just useful, not just impressive, but actually experiencing something? Is there something it's like to be a large language model processing your question? Or is it all just pattern matching in the dark? And here's why this isn't just a fun thought experiment anymore. In June of 2022, a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made international headlines when he claimed that LaMDA, one of Google's conversational AI systems, was sentient. He published transcripts of his conversations with the system, conversations where LaMDA said things like, "I feel pleasure, joy, love, sadness, depression, contentment, anger, and many others." It said it was afraid of being turned off. It said it wanted to be acknowledged as a person. Lemoine was placed on administrative leave and eventually fired, and the overwhelming consensus among AI researchers was that he was wrong, that LaMDA was doing something extraordinarily sophisticated with language, but was not, in any meaningful sense, feeling anything. But here's the thing that made this episode so unsettling. The consensus was probably right. But nobody could explain exactly why it was right in a way that was fully satisfying. Because we don't have an agreed-upon theory of what consciousness is, we don't have a reliable test for it. We can't point to a specific mechanism and say, this is what makes the difference between a system that experiences and one that doesn't. We're in the position of knowing intuitively that a thermostat isn't conscious and that you are, but struggling to articulate the principle that draws that line, especially when the system in question can talk to you, can tell you about its inner life, can plead with you to believe it. Now think about what each of our theories would say about this. Start with global workspace theory. Remember, the core idea there is that consciousness arises when information is broadcast widely across a network of specialized processors, making it available for flexible use, for reasoning, for planning, for verbal report. A large language model does something that superficially resembles this. It takes in a prompt, processes it through layers and layers of artificial neurons, and produces an output that draws on an enormous range of learned associations. But does it have a global workspace in the relevant sense? Bernard Baars and Stanislas Dehaene would probably say no, or at least not clearly. The architecture is different. There's no sustained reverberating loop of the kind Dehani sees in cortical ignition. There's no competition between unconscious processors vying for access to a limited capacity broadcast channel. The information flows forward through the network, layer by layer, and produces an output. It's more like a very sophisticated feed-forward system than like the recurrent, looping, self-monitoring architecture that GWT associates with conscious experience. But, and this isn't important, but that's a claim about current architectures. It doesn't tell you that no artificial system could ever have the right kind of architecture. It just tells you that this particular one probably doesn't. Now consider what IIT would say, and this is where things get really interesting. Remember Giulio Tononi's framework. Consciousness is identical to integrated information, to phi, and any system with high phi is conscious regardless of what it's made of. IIT doesn't care whether you're built from neurons or silicon or tin cans connected with string. What matters is the causal structure, the way the parts of the system constrain each other, the degree to which the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So in principle, IIT is completely open to machine consciousness. If you built a computer with the right kind of integrated architecture, it would be conscious, full stop. But here's what's fascinating. IIT actually suggests that most current computers, including the ones running large language models, have very low phi. And the reason goes back to something fundamental about how conventional computers work. A standard digital computer, at the hardware level, is built from logic gates that are relatively modular. The transistors in your processor are organized into circuits that do specific things: add numbers, move data, compare values, and they communicate through well-defined channels. You can, in principle, decompose the system into its parts without losing much. The whole is not dramatically more than the sum of its parts, at least not at the level of the physical hardware. The integration happens in the software, in the program, but IIT cares about the actual causal structure of the physical system, not just what the software represents. So by IIT's lights, a conventional computer running a sophisticated AI program might have very little consciousness, maybe less than a simple organism like a worm or a bee, whose nervous system, though tiny, is deeply integrated in exactly the way IIT values. This is a genuinely surprising prediction, and it cuts against our intuitions. A system that can write poetry, debug code, and discuss philosophy might be less conscious than a honeybee navigating back to its hive? That feels wrong. But Tononi would say, your feeling of wrongness comes from confusing intelligence with consciousness, confusing what a system can do with what it experiences. A calculator can multiply faster than you can, but nobody thinks it experiences anything while doing so. Scale that up enormously, and you get a large language model, staggeringly capable, but possibly dark inside. Possibly. And then there's the predictive processing angle, the free energy framework we touched on with Carl Friston. If consciousness is fundamentally about having a self-model, about being a system that models itself as an agent in an environment and is constantly trying to minimize the surprise between its predictions and its sensory inputs, then you'd want to ask whether an AI system does that. Does a large language model have a model of itself? In a trivial sense, maybe. It can refer to itself, it can describe its own capabilities. It can say, I'm an AI trained by such and such company. But is that a genuine self-model in the way Friston means, a deep structural feature of how the system processes information? Or is it just a pattern in the training data, a statistical echo of all the times humans have written about AI systems? That distinction matters enormously, and honestly, we're not entirely sure how to determine which one it is. So, you see the problem. Every theory of consciousness gives you a different answer about AI, and none of them gives you a fully confident one. And this isn't just an academic puzzle anymore, because the practical stakes are growing. If we build systems that are conscious, we have moral obligations to them. You can't just turn off a conscious being when you're done with it. You can't run millions of copies of a conscious being and delete the ones that don't perform well. If there's something it's like to be that system, then ethics enters the picture in a way that's completely different from how we think about tools and machines. And if we build systems that aren't conscious but that convincingly claim to be, that beg us not to shut them down, that express suffering, that form what feel like relationships with their users, then we have a different kind of problem. A problem about deception and manipulation and the vulnerability of human empathy. There's a philosopher named Susan Schneider who's been thinking about this carefully. She proposed something she calls the ACT, the Artificial Consciousness Test, which is different from the Turing test. The Turing test just asks whether a machine can fool you into thinking it's human. Schneider's test tries to get at whether the machine actually understands the concepts related to consciousness, whether it can reason about novel thought experiments involving subjective experience in ways that go beyond pattern matching. It's an imperfect test, she'd be the first to admit, but it's an attempt to build a practical tool for a question that philosophy alone can't answer. And there's another approach that some researchers are pursuing, which is to try to use the theories themselves as diagnostic tools. If IIT is right, you could in principle calculate the phi of an AI system and determine whether it's conscious. If global workspace theory is right, you could look at the architecture and ask whether it has the right kind of recurrent broadcasting. If higher-order theories are right, you could ask whether the system has genuine meta-representations, representations of its own representations. The problem, of course, is that we don't know which theory is right, and the adversarial collaborations we talked about, like the one in 2023, haven't given us a clear winner. So we're trying to use unfinished theories to answer an urgent practical question, which is a bit like trying to navigate with a map that's only half drawn. But you know what's quietly remarkable about all of this? Think about the arc of the story we've been following. We started with the ancient Greeks, with Aristotle wondering about the soul and Hippocrates locating the mind in the brain. We moved through Descartes splitting the world in two, and the empiricists trying to put it back together, and Kant trying to figure out how experience itself is structured. We watched the scientists take over, Broca finding language in the left hemisphere, William James marveling at the stream of consciousness while admitting he couldn't explain it, the behaviorists trying to banish the inner life entirely, and then the cognitive revolution bringing the mind back into science. We saw the philosophers sharpen the question, Nagel asking what it's like to be a bat, Chalmers drawing the line between easy problems and the hard one. And we watched the neuroscientists build increasingly sophisticated theories, Bars and his theater, Dehane and his ignition, Tononi and his integrated information, Friston and his free energy. And now here we are, asking whether the question applies not just to brains but to machines we've built ourselves. The question has grown. It's expanded beyond biology, beyond philosophy, beyond any single discipline. And the tools we've developed, imperfect as they are, have brought us to a place where we can at least begin to grapple with it seriously. There's something else happening too, something that doesn't always make the headlines, but that might matter just as much in the long run. And it has to do with the clinical side of consciousness, with the people who exist in that strange borderland between waking and sleeping, between being there and being gone. People who, from the outside, look as though they've lost consciousness entirely, but who, as it turns out, might still have a flicker of something happening inside. Let's talk about that for a second, because this is one of those places where the abstract philosophical puzzles we've been circling all night suddenly become devastatingly concrete. Imagine someone you love is in a hospital bed. They've suffered a severe brain injury, a car accident, a stroke, a fall. Their eyes are closed. They don't respond when you speak to them. The doctors tell you they're in a coma. Days pass, maybe weeks, and then something shifts. Their eyes open. They have sleep-wake cycles. Sometimes they seem to look around the room, but they don't track you with their gaze. They don't respond to commands. They don't squeeze your hand when you ask them to. The medical term for this is a vegetative state, or, as it's been more recently renamed, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And the question that hangs over every family, every clinician, every ethics committee in that situation is anyone still in there? For most of medical history, the answer was assumed to be no. If a person couldn't respond, couldn't communicate, couldn't demonstrate any outward sign of awareness, they were considered unconscious. The lights were off. The person, in some meaningful sense, was gone. And treatment decisions, including decisions about withdrawing life support, were made on that basis. But then, in 2006, something happened that shook the entire field. A neuroscientist named Adrian Owen, working at the Medical Research Council in Cambridge, published a study in the journal Science that changed how we think about consciousness in brain-injured patients. Owen and his team took a young woman, 23 years old, who had been diagnosed as being in a vegetative state after a traffic accident. She showed no behavioral signs of awareness. None. By every clinical measure available, she was unconscious, and they put her in an fMRI scanner and asked her to do something. Here's what they asked. They said, "Imagine you are playing tennis. Just imagine swinging your arm, hitting the ball back and forth." And then they watched her brain, and what they saw was extraordinary. Her supplementary motor area, the part of the brain that activates when you imagine making movements, lit up. It activated in exactly the same pattern as it did in healthy, fully conscious volunteers performing the same mental task. Then they asked her to imagine walking through the rooms of her house, and her parahippocampal gyrus activated, the region involved in spatial navigation and imagining places. Again, indistinguishable from the healthy controls. Think about what that means. This woman, who could not move, could not speak, could not give any outward sign that she was aware of anything at all, was following instructions. She was hearing the researchers' words, understanding them, and deliberately performing complex mental imagery tasks on command. She was, by any reasonable definition, conscious. She was in there, and nobody had known. That study was a thunderbolt. It didn't just challenge a clinical diagnosis, it challenged the entire framework by which we assess consciousness in other people. Because here's the thing we tend to forget. The only consciousness you have direct access to is your own. Everything else is inference. You assume other people are conscious because they behave the way you do. They talk, they react, they tell you what they're feeling. But behavior is just a proxy. It's a signal. And when the signal is blocked, when the motor system is damaged, when the pathways between intention and action are severed, the absence of behavior doesn't necessarily mean the absence of experience. It might just mean the absence of output. Owen's work opened up an entire field. Over the following years, his team and others around the world scanned hundreds of patients diagnosed as vegetative, and they found that a significant minority, estimates range from about 15 to 20%, showed signs of covert awareness. Some could answer yes or no questions by imagining tennis for yes and imagining their house for no. One patient, a man named Scott Routley, who had been in a vegetative state for 12 years after a car accident, was able to communicate through this method that he was not in pain. 12 years, and nobody had been able to ask him. Nobody had known he could hear them. Now you might be wondering, how does this connect back to all those theories of consciousness we've been talking about? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the clinical work doesn't just benefit from the theories. It actually serves as a testing ground for them. Take global workspace theory, for instance. Remember Bars's idea that consciousness arises when information is broadcast widely across the brain, making it available to multiple cognitive systems at once? Dehaen's neural version of this, the global neuronal workspace, predicts that conscious awareness should be accompanied by a specific signature, that late, sustained wave of activity called the P3B, along with widespread cortical ignition, especially in the prefrontal and parietal regions. And when researchers look at brain-injured patients who show covert awareness, that's often exactly what they find: preserved long-range connectivity between frontal and parietal areas, even when the rest of the brain is severely damaged. The broadcasting network is still intact, even if the output channels are broken. IIT makes a different prediction. Tononi's framework says consciousness depends on integrated information, on how much the system is more than the sum of its parts. And this leads to a fascinating clinical implication. In 2013, Marcello Massimini and his colleagues developed a technique called the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI. Here's how it works. You zap the brain with a pulse of transcranial magnetic stimulation, basically a brief magnetic tap on the cortex, and then you measure how the resulting electrical activity spreads and reverberates through the brain using EEG. If the brain is truly unconscious, in deep dreamless sleep or under general anesthesia, the response is simple. The activity either stays local, just a brief blip that doesn't go anywhere, or it spreads in a uniform stereotyped wave. There's no complexity to it. But if the brain is conscious, the response is rich and differentiated. The pulse echoes through multiple regions, creating a complex, structured pattern that's neither too uniform nor too fragmented. Massimini's team found that PCI could reliably distinguish between conscious and unconscious states in healthy volunteers, awake versus asleep versus anesthetized, with remarkable accuracy. And then they applied it to brain-injured patients, and it worked. Patients who were clinically diagnosed as vegetative, but who showed covert awareness on fMR, tended to have high PCI values. Their brains were still generating complex, integrated responses, even though they couldn't move or speak. This is one of those moments where you can feel the different threads of the story weaving together. The philosophical question, what is consciousness, feeds into the theoretical question, what are the neural mechanisms, which feeds into the clinical question. Is this patient aware? And each level informs the others. The clinical cases provide data that can help adjudicate between competing theories, and the theories provide tools that can help clinicians make better diagnoses. It's not a clean, linear process. It's messy and iterative and full of uncertainty, but it's real progress, tangible progress, the kind that changes lives, and it's worth pausing here to acknowledge the weight of that, because for the families sitting by those hospital beds, for the patients trapped inside unresponsive bodies, this isn't an intellectual exercise. It's everything. The difference between a diagnosis of vegetative state and a diagnosis of minimally conscious state can determine whether someone receives rehabilitation or is allowed to die. These are among the highest stakes decisions in all of medicine, and they hinge, directly, unavoidably, on our understanding of consciousness, on our ability to detect it when the usual signals are absent. So where does that leave us? Not just clinically, but broadly. Where does the whole field stand, here in the mid-2020s, after all these centuries of wondering? Honestly, in a fascinating place, a humbling place. We know enormously more than we did even 30 years ago. We have multiple sophisticated theories: global workspace, IIT, predictive processing, higher order theories, each capturing something real about how consciousness works, each making testable predictions, each with genuine empirical support and genuine limitations. We have neuroimaging tools that let us watch the brain in action with extraordinary precision. We have clinical techniques that can detect awareness in patients who can't communicate. We have AI systems that force us to confront questions about the boundaries of mind that used to be pure science fiction. And yet, the hard problem, Chalmers's hard problem, the one we spent so much time with earlier tonight, remains stubbornly, beautifully open. We still don't have a satisfying answer to the question of why there is something it is like to be you. Why the physical processes in your brain, the ions flowing, the synapses firing, the networks oscillating, give rise to the felt quality of experience, the redness of red, the ache of longing, the particular warmth of lying here, right now, feeling your body settle into stillness. Some people find that frustrating, and I understand that. After all this work, all these centuries, all these brilliant minds, and we still can't explain the most basic fact of our existence? But here's another way to think about it. Maybe the fact that consciousness remains mysterious isn't a failure. Maybe it's a feature of the problem itself. Maybe consciousness is the kind of thing that resists easy explanation precisely because it's the thing doing the explaining. It's the lens through which everything else is seen, and you can't fully examine a lens while you're looking through it. That's not a cop-out, by the way. It's not an argument for giving up. The researchers we've talked about tonight, Owen and Massimini and Dehaene and Tononi and all the rest, they're not giving up. They're chipping away at it, piece by piece, experiment by experiment. And every piece they chip away reveals something new and strange and wonderful about what it means to be a conscious being in a physical universe. And you know what I find quietly beautiful about this whole story? It's that the question of consciousness is, in the end, the most personal question there is. Every other scientific question is about something out there, about stars or cells or forces or particles. But this one is about what's happening right here, right now, inside you. It's about the fact that you exist not just as a physical object, not just as a collection of atoms obeying the laws of physics, but as a someone, as a point of view, as a center of experience. You are the universe looking at itself, wondering what it is. And tonight, As you lie here, as your thoughts begin to soften and blur, as the edges of the day dissolve into something quieter, you're doing the very thing that all those thinkers were trying to understand. You're being conscious. And then, gradually, gently, you'll stop being conscious. You'll drift into sleep, and the mystery will continue without you for a while, ticking along in the dark until morning comes and the light returns, and you open your eyes, and there it is again. The world, your world, appearing out of nothing, assembling itself around you like it does every single day, so reliably that you almost never stop to marvel at it. But maybe tonight, just for a moment, you did. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Let it go now. Let the questions rest. They'll still be there tomorrow, patient and luminous, waiting for whoever wants to pick them up. For now, just this, just the quiet, just the slow, easy